Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I am delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Norman, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kent. He is a well-known humanist, philosopher and ethicist, and has published widely on this field. I was looking at his books today and I saw that his first book was written several years before I was even born. His latest book, What is Humanism For?, asks many critical questions about the role of humanism in the modern world. Today we're going to be diving into some very deep questions. So, Professor Richard Norman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Could you just give us an overview, first of all, as to the broad categories of ways that humans can know what is right and what is wrong?
Well, I suppose the two broad categories are either appealing to human sources or appealing to some idea of a non-human source. So if I could elaborate on the first of all, and then we could perhaps think about the contrast. For me, the way in which I think about and make decisions about what I think is right is by drawing on shared values, shared human values, which I think all human beings share, because we share our lives with one another. And I'm talking about very basic values here, values of kindness, care, compassion, honesty, loyalty, justice, fairness, and so forth. And these are values that you find in all the great religions and are equally shared by people who don't have a religion. And they're shared because we share in communities with one another, and these values are integral to life in a community. And they're very basic values, obviously, and they leave in practice a lot of questions open as to what we should do in relation to particular dilemmas or particular choices. And at that point, we have to use our own reason to make our own decisions, thinking about the consequences of our actions, thinking about what those values actually mean in particular cases. But that's the broad perspective that I would go for. I don't appeal to any particular moral theory, utilitarianism or virtue ethics or Kantian ethics or anything like that. I think all those theories just reflect different aspects of that shared common language of values, which we all recognize, I think. Let me try that as a start and see what you think.
I think that's a very good start. It lays it out very simply. But I suppose the next logical question is, if these values are really universal, where do they come from?
Well, again, I would want to say they come from our nature as social beings. The fact that we live in communities, we're brought up within a family. From a very early age, human beings automatically come to empathize with one another, to respond to one another's feelings. And it's on the basis of that, again, from an early age, we learn those values just as part of living with other human beings.
You're saying that they're taught generation after generation, they are taught from parent to child. Is that where you're saying
yes,
they
yes,
originate?
Absolutely, yes. But it's not just explicit teaching. Sometimes a parent will say, don't do that, it's naughty, or that's not fair, or that's unkind, or whatever. And it's through that explicit teaching that we learn a language. But it doesn't just come from being told things by parents or elders. It comes from our experience of the relationships that we have with one another. Relationships, the young child playing with other children will want to share purposes and activities with others. If you think about children's games, the notion of fairness comes very, very quickly. That's not fair, a child will say, if the other child is not playing properly. So it's a learning that comes partly from explicit statements from our parents and explicit instructions, but just from the whole experience of sharing our lives with other people and living in communities.
I suppose that explains how we acquire those values, but it still leaves me asking, how did those values arise in any humans, the first humans, from the start? I mean, why is kindness and justice and fairness something which we have always learnt from our experiences? Why not greed and hate? I'm still trying to go
Yes.
deeper as to where these values came from.
Well, I mean, like everything else in human beings, they come from an evolutionary process. Human beings, as a species, as a biological species, have always been a social species. That goes for other species as well, and you see the rudiments of moral behaviour in other species which are relatively close to human beings, in chimpanzees and gorillas and so forth. You see them caring for one another. What then is particularly further distinctive of human beings is, that we possess a more developed consciousness. We possess a language, so that we not only act on our instincts of sociality and empathy and so forth, but we can also reflect on these, recognize the value of them, recognize how important they are for our lives, recognize that our lives go well if we live by the values that enable us to get on with one another, recognize that our lives go badly when we come into conflict with one another. So it's that combination of, I suppose, biologically inherited instincts plus our capacity to think, to reflect, and to weigh up and ponder the nature of our instincts.
Okay, so if I've understood it, you see the concepts of right and wrong as social behaviors which arise from our evolutionary biology and which are refined by our experiences and our intelligence, which allows us to see the benefits of living out those values. Is that right?
That's a good summary.
So just to be absolutely clear, you don't have a concept of right and wrong beyond the human. There's nothing metaphysical. There's nothing. If humans didn't exist, right and wrong wouldn't exist. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, if you think of the behavior of other species, it's conceivable that the concepts of right and wrong could make sense in the context of the behavior of other species. I think the species that we know on our Earth don't have those capacities that I just talked about. So it would not make, although, as I said, some species show the rudiments of moral behavior. You wouldn't call them fully moral beings. Now, it's conceivable that elsewhere in the universe there may be other beings who have something comparable, and where the notion of right and wrong might have some application. And what would count as right and wrong for this possible other species would depend on the nature of their lives, their biological nature, whether they live in a society and so forth. So it's difficult to speculate as to whether the notion of right and wrong would make sense in that context. But as you say, not a metaphysical basis, a human basis.
Okay, I think I've understood that clearly. So if we take the origin as evolutionary, I know you're not an evolutionary biologist, but as far as I understand it, all human behavior traits is really about preservation of the genes, especially your own genes. How would that account for things which are not obviously of any benefit to continuation of the species? For example, I'm thinking of compassion for endangered animals or something like that. There's no obvious reason why we should be doing that as a biological species if it is just a purely biological origin.
Well, I think you're, if I may say so, too impressed by people like Richard Dawkins and the notion that everything about us is simply a device for perpetuating our genes. Basic feature. Of course, at a certain level, we can explain why human beings are in terms of their genes, and we can explain how genes function and reproduce themselves in terms of the science of genetics. But we can't it's a mistake then to transfer that sort of language to the language of human behavior and the language of human values. It's not that moral values are simply a device for perpetuating our genes. Our genes give us the human capacities that then enable us to think in value terms, to recognize what's right and what's wrong. So it's a question of different levels of explanation, different levels of vocabulary here.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose from people from a theistic perspective, one of the things I think that we struggle with is, where does the authority for these values comes from? I mean, if somebody were to question, why is it good to share? I disagree. I don't think it's good to share. I mean, how would any concept of authority arise as to know what is right and what is wrong?
Well, first of all, I want to be a bit cautious at the notion of authority. I mean, that can mean various things. I would want to get away from the idea that doing the right thing consists in obedience to an authority outside us. That seems to me to put the emphasis in the wrong place.
Can I just clarify my question then? Maybe I used the wrong word. I didn't mean obedience to another authority. I meant what gives them any validity is maybe a better word.
Yes.
If somebody questioned the validity of what you said or I said was right or wrong, how would we be able to assert the validity of our claim?
Well, let's take your example of sharing. Sharing is something that comes naturally because it's built into our lives as communal beings. Now, of course, that sometimes gives rise to conflicts and problems. A frequent occurrence for a young child will be being told, no, don't take everything for yourself, you've got to share. And it's in that context that the child might say, well, why have I got to share? One obvious response that would then be made to the child was, well, how would you like it if somebody else took things away from you and wouldn't let you share things? Now, it's no accident that that's classically the kind of thing that a parent or a mentor would say to a child, because the question, how would you like it, is one that appeals to our capacity to put ourselves in one another's position, to understand what it's like. And again, that's linked up with what I was saying about deep instincts, deep features of human beings. Now, of course, when you talk about the authority of such values and those ways of thinking about them, there's no guarantee that human beings will always respond to the force of those considerations. There's no guarantee that human beings will respond to any supposed authority for moral values. And I think a theistic account has the same problem. If someone's, if you were to say to someone, well, it's God's will that you should act in that way, and if they then say, but why should I do what's God's will, or why should I take any notice if you'll talk about a God? Ultimately, we reach a point where we just have to say, well, that's how things are. That's how we are as human beings. So it's a mistake. Again, let me link that with what we were just saying. It's a mistake to look for some kind of metaphysical basis that somehow sees these things as values as built into the nature of the universe, such that they have a force which we just, have to and cannot avoid going along with. That's not where we are, I think. It's an inescapable fact that people won't always do the right thing, and beyond a certain point, the reasons why they ought to give out.
Okay, the issue then of doing the right thing, if it's a human construct or a human evaluation, how do you deal with the fact that two people will look at the same issue, very good people, in their own ways, very good, decent people, kind, caring people, and come to diametrically opposed views? What does that say about two things? One, how this all arose. How can the same process lead to completely different outcomes? And secondly, then, how do we resolve it? So again, origin and outcome, I guess.
Yes, yeah. Let me go back to what I was saying about basic values, because basic values are just the building blocks, the starting point from which we do our moral thinking. Now, of course, a lot of our moral disagreements at a practical level arise out of disagreements, often factual disagreements, but also disagreements about what those values actually mean in particular situations. How you weigh those values against one another. Let me take an example. The value of human life is absolutely fundamental. But of course, that leaves us with a lot of very difficult dilemmas in particular situations. Just to take a classic one, some people will say the value of human life is such that it could never be right to intentionally end the life of another human being. Other people would say, well, what if your country is being invaded by another country, and the only way in which you can defend your country is by fighting, and that inevitably means taking the lives of other human beings. Now, we there enter into a classic, difficult area of moral thinking. Some people would say killing in self-defense is an exception. Then they would have to think about how killing in defense of your country is related to killing in self-defense. Some people would be absolute pacifists and would say, well, nothing can justify even killing in war. Those are, the argument could go on, and of course it does go on, and it's something that people deeply disagree about. It's an example of the kind of deep disagreement that you've just mentioned. But the fact that we disagree about it is because we recognize and share that fundamental value of respect for human life. And we recognize that it creates difficult dilemmas for us, and we have to think them through. And again, appealing to some kind of external source, I would say in particular a religious source, won't solve the problem. Famously, religious people disagree about that. If you take that example, disagree about it just in the same way that non-religious people do. Religious people, some people will say, well, God is telling us to defend our country. Other people will say, no, God can never want us to kill one another. Christianity, of course, is absolutely riven with disagreements about what to do in cases of war, whether it's ever right to kill in war. There are Christians who will say, I could never kill. Quakers famously, and a lot of Quakers are like that. So there's no escaping the necessity to just think through our values, think about what makes them important for us, and think about what they mean in particular situations, and think about the consequences of acting on them.
Okay, so who gets to say, I mean, you've made an assertion, which I do agree with, actually, that we have these universal human values, but someone might not agree with that, and they may want to take over the world and have a completely different set of values, which involve the strong should wipe out the weak. Mm-hmm. Who gets to say what the universal values are?
We all do. That's the nature of the situation, that as we are doing now, we debate with one another, we argue with one another. I mean, the question who gets to say, again, implies that there is, we have to look for some authority in some rather strong sense who will tell us the answers, but that's not the situation we're in. Morality is all about discussion, debate, thinking things through with one another.
No, but let me make it more concrete then. Let's say you have two different countries. Mm-hmm. And well, let's give you a simple example. The ethically minded people of the UK could come together and agree something like homosexuality there's nothing morally wrong about it. Mm-hmm. It is right, Mm-hmm. And the same equivalent people in, say, Uganda, which is very homophobic by Western standards, could come to the discussion and come to the exact opposite answer. Mm-hmm. Are they both right? Is it contextual? Is it about, well, in a certain context, A can be right, and in a certain context, the exact opposite can be right? Or is there always one which is right?
Some things are contextual, relatively superficial ways of behaving. It'll be the right way in a certain culture. It'll be the right way to do things in another culture. It'll be the wrong thing. In Islamic cultures, for example, you will take off your shoes when entering someone's house. That's the right thing to do. In other cultural contexts, there's no particular obligation to do so. But that's a relatively superficial example. Of course, if we take your example of homosexuality, I think most people would want to say that's something that goes deeper. It's not just a matter of fitting into a particular culture. Again, that's an example where you wouldn't just stop at the level of saying, well, I think homosexuality is okay. No, I think homosexuality is evil or whatever. You would look at things like the nature of love, the relationship between love and sexuality, in what way sexuality can be an expression of love. Does sexuality have other kinds of meaning for human beings? Are those important? Do they conflict with sexual behavior as an expression of love? There are familiar questions there, but ones which people have tried to think through in relation to the rights and wrongs of homosexuality. They're not easy, and that's why people feel very strongly about it, and that's why people still disagree about it. But at the same time, it's possible to think rationally and discuss reasonably with one another what we feel about it, and that's shown by the fact that people come to change their minds. Again, no guarantees. Maybe we will just reach deadlock. But I think it's important that we recognize that it's something that we can talk about reasonably and that we can try to seek agreement on what is right at the fundamental level.
I agree with you. But doesn't this rely on there being a sufficient body of rational, reasonable people to have these conversations? I mean, we have seen in certain parts of the world that discussion has become toxic, polarized, reason, rationality, all of the things which are really required for this process of secular ethics have gone out of the window. Now, of course, I'm not saying that a theistic approach would have solved this. That isn't really what we're talking about. But doesn't the whole process fall down when we don't have a society that thinks reasonably, rationally, and, in the ways that we are required?
It might. We might fail. Humanity might in the end destroy itself because it's incapable of using its rationality sufficiently. It's incapable of being reasonable. Sometimes I fear that might happen sometimes when I look around the world. And part of the problem is that it's not just people's moral thinking, but the way in which people are governed by extremely misleading belief systems. I mean, we talked about I think you refer to the ideas of a superior race or something, a superior human group or something like that. These are ideas, that are fed on bogus science, for example, and some people fall for them. Some people make foolish decisions about them. And again, I'm sorry to keep repeating this, but no guarantees. Some people sometimes think irrationally. Some people sometimes behave irrationality. I'm afraid that's part of the human condition, just as our capacity for doing the right thing and for thinking reasonably and rationally is also a part of the human condition. So I should stress, as a humanist, I'm not starry-eyed about human beings. I don't idealize about human beings and think that human beings are inherently good. Our biological roots make it the case that we are a very mixed species which has conflicting instincts, conflicting capacities, and I hope it'll end well. Well, it won't end. I'm not sure whether it will end or not, but I hope
it might end.
It might end badly. It might end badly, I'm afraid. And that's the human condition.
One thing I'm interested in about your kind of approach is we can look back at previous ages, different periods of history, and we can use our value system of today to decide whether things were right or wrong. I mean, it doesn't affect those people, they're long gone, but we can have a moral judgment on it. For example, we can talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and we can say that is unequivocally wrong. Okay. Now, my question is this. Isn't it obvious that in 100 years, 200 years, the people of that time will look at the decisions we make and will probably think similar things about that? And if that is the case, then does that not undermine or kind of what we're doing?
I think slavery is a very good example. I mean, before you introduced it, I was going to say, how about the example of slavery? Over past few centuries, there's been a radical change in people's appreciation of the morality or immorality of slavery. And it's interesting to think about how that happened. I mean, the slave trade began through a process of cultures and civilizations coming into contact with one another, and the phenomenon of dehumanizing the other when you come across other human beings which seem different from yourself and seem strange. And the whole institution of slavery has been built on that dehumanizing of other people, because we don't actually share our lives with them, and it's all too easily just to think of them as more like a different species. But of course, it's also increasing contact with other cultures and other societies and other human groups that makes us realize that, famously, they are human beings like ourselves. Remember, that the great slogan of the campaign against the slave trade was a slave saying, "Am I not a human and a brother?" And things changed because increasingly people came to recognize that that was the case. People entering into relationships with people who were slaves and who they might have thought of as a different species, and come to recognize how much they shared in common. Now, that's a good example of moral progress. And I would see it as moral progress. I think I would want to say human beings have come to recognize something morally, have come to see it. Comparably, as you say, it's possible that in 200 years' time, people may look back on things that we take for granted and look back on us and think, how could they behave in that way? By definition, we don't know what they are. If we're guessing on that, I mean, again, a more recent change that's happened is our attitudes to non-human living things, animals. And I guess that's a change that's still in process of happening. And we don't know in what ways people in 200 years' time might look back at us and think, how could we treat other living things the way that we did? Some people, been discussing with people quite recently, the idea of whether natural phenomena should be recognized as having rights. Do rivers have rights? Do trees have rights? I'm not sure what to think about it. It's possible that in 200 years' time, people will look back and say, how on earth could they not recognize that a river is a living thing that deserves respect, just as another human being deserves respect? As an individual, I'm still making up my mind about that. There may be big cultural changes comparable to people coming to recognize the iniquity of slavery. We don't know. Again, I come back to the fact we just have to keep doing our best to think about it as reasonably as we can, think through what our basic values commit us to, what they mean in particular contexts, and try to work it out.
Yeah, again, I think a lot of my questions are and I'm beginning to understand a bit more of the way you're thinking, but you're basically saying that we just have to do the best we can with what we have in our lives, and it's not really about achieving some sort of absolute right or wrong. It's about doing the most right that we can with the values that we have as humans right now. A bigger question, which I'm sure you have discussed. If we're just biological creatures and right and wrong are kind of behaviors that we have learned which benefit us all, and goodness arises in that way, what is the ultimate purpose of our lives, as an individual and also as a species? What's the point of humanity?
I think I want to question the word ultimate, and I guess also that the notion of the point of humanity. I mean, I think the idea that there is a point of humanity in the sense of there being a purpose for which human beings exist does presuppose a theistic context, doesn't it? If you don't believe in a divine creator, you don't believe human beings have been created for a purpose, where by definition that would be some kind of external purpose. Now, that may sound worrying because it may suggest, well, our lives are purposeless. Of course, they're not. People find all sorts of purposes that give meaning to their lives. People find purposes in creative activity, for example, in the arts, in gardening, in making a beautiful house to live in. People find purpose in bringing up children, devoting to their families, honouring their elders. People find purpose in contributing to the wider society. And one important feature of those examples is that those purposes, though they're not non-human purposes, and they're not purposes that for which we are created, they are purposes that involve us in the betterment of something larger than ourselves. The family, a larger community, the bettering of humanity, wanting things to get better for future generations. And in thinking about our relationship to something larger than ourselves, we also need to think about the fact that we're not just a part of human communities, we're part of the natural world, we are custodians of the natural world, and crucially important purposes for many people will be wanting to nurture and protect the natural world, to stop the damage that we're doing to it, to combat the problem of climate change and the way in which that's destroying the natural environment. Now, those are purposes which give huge meaning to people's lives. And they're not purposes for which we exist, but they are purposes which matter to us, purposes which give us a sense of direction, give us a sense of meaning. So in a way, although you say it's a deeper question, it's parallel to what we were saying about moral values, really. It's, they're rooted not in something outside ourselves, but in what matters to us as humans.
Yeah, I think it's been brought back into that. But and I do totally agree with you, and I'm sure everyone of all faiths or none would share those same desires for purpose. And it's amazing actually how, whether you believe in an ultimate purpose for humanity or not, the actual purposes in our lives, that the daily lives people lead, are very similar all over the world, whether
Yes.
you believe in God or don't. But yeah, no, it is the deeper question I'm interested. I'm also asking, what's the point of the whole thing? We want society to be better. Well, so what? Why? Why? We don't know why we got here. So if you take God out of the equation, we don't really know why we got here. We don't know why anything really exists. I do think there's a difference between an individual finding purpose or meaning in the things in their life and asking, I can ask, why do stars exist? You could say, well, there's no real purpose to them existing.
Yes.
Does humanism have an answer to why humans exist at all? Or maybe a bigger question, why life exists?
Well, I think we need to talk about the difference between causal explanations in terms of a cause and explanations in terms of a purpose. Why the Earth exists, why stars and galaxies exist, why human beings exist. It can be answered scientifically, and we can trace how these things happened. We can identify the causes that brought them into existence. But ultimately, humanists would say, the idea that the appropriate explanation is some kind of external purpose for which these things exist is the wrong question.
All right. Just a couple of questions which are really about crosstalk here. So the first one, is there anything that you think religion gets right about morality, which secular people, humanists, can benefit from? And then we'll flip it the other way after that.
Okay. Okay. Yes, that's a very, very good question and a very interesting one, and I'm not sure about my answer to it. As a question for me, I think it, what I wonder is whether humanists are missing something insofar as they lack communal rituals, practices, the kind that encourage them to and promote the contemplation of the values that are important to them. I'm thinking about religious prayer, for example, communal prayer, not so much individual prayer, but clearly it's a powerful phenomenon that people come together to pray. As humanists, as a humanist, I don't pray, of course, because I don't think in terms of a non-human being to whom I could address my prayers. But I can see, looking at religious people coming together to pray, I can see how that can be something powerful for them in bringing them together to think about the things that matter to them, to think about what they should be living for. I was, let me just say anecdotally, I was watching a filming of the celebration of Eid at Bradford Mosque earlier in the year. I was happened to be looking at this yesterday. And seeing people come together for the prayers at the end of Ramadan, and the Imam was speaking to them and talking about the values which hopefully during Ramadan they have come to appreciate, and then to pray that they should live in accordance with those values. Now I can see that kind of communal practice could be important in reinforcing people's commitment to the values, reminding them of what their values are. Without that, perhaps there's a problem that we don't often enough come together to think about those things. Of course, we confront dilemmas in our daily lives and we have to make up our minds what to do about them. But perhaps those sorts of communal ritual practices serve a purpose. And you can think about other religious rituals as well. Pilgrimage, I'm rather attracted to the idea of pilgrimages, going on a pilgrimage with other people, coming to know other people, sharing your lives with other people, and thinking of the pilgrimage as a kind of emblem of a human life and the progress that you make in a human life. I can imagine both the practice of fasting and the practice of sharing a meal together. And of course, at some level, we all share meals with one another, and we enjoy the fellowship that comes with doing that. But they're more ritualized, of course, within theistic and religious contexts. So I'm interested in the question of whether humanists might be able to learn something from those practices.
I suppose what I'm also asking is, are there any ethical standards which maybe religion has come up with, which maybe secular ethicists haven't yet? For example, the concept of turning the other cheek
Yes.
in Christianity. Are these things which maybe secular societies haven't yet reached in terms of a level of morality?
I don't know. I think we would be going back into our earlier discussions, wouldn't we? The example of forgiveness just takes us back into the role that forgiveness plays in human lives. Of course, we know that if we go on nurturing grievances against one another, giving rise to vendettas, to desires for revenge, that's not a healthy basis for our relationships with one another. On the other hand,
sure. What I'm really getting at there, yes. Richard, is do humanists ever look to religious traditions as inspiration for ethical values? You may not disagree that whether God exists or whether they have any kind of divine authority, but as a lot of people can look at, say, the Sermon on the Mount, whether they believe in God or not, and say that is an extremely high ethical standard. Do you find that you do look at religious traditions for any inspiration in this case, or do you feel it's best just to leave them to the side and start afresh?
Well, I can't speak for all humanists. I mean, I do. I read scriptures of different religions. I look for what I can learn from them. The Sermon on the Mount is the finest section of the Bible, I think, and certainly the finest section of the Gospels. And thinking about it, I wouldn't necessarily automatically adopt it, and there are questions you can ask about turning the other cheek, but it's an inspiring ideal, and I think about it, and I think through how far it's a livable ideal, just in the way that Christians do. Christians who are pressed on this will sometimes say, well, yes, turn the other cheek, but we've only got two cheeks, and you reach a point where where turning the other cheek gives out. So yes, and not just to scriptures and holy books, but other religious people, their lives I find inspiring. Martin Luther King, for example, his leading a campaign of non-violent resistance against racism and for justice and equality. Hugely inspiring.
Final question here, Richard. What would you like theists, believers, to take from humanism or secular ethics, which could benefit them in the world that we live in today?
I think we want to come full circle at this point and go back to what I said at the very beginning, the recognition of shared human values. Some religious people recognize, of course, that they share values with humanists and other non-religious people, but there's still a tendency amongst some religious people will say, well, if you've got no God, then you can't have morals. I would want people to recognize, just by looking around them and looking at the people that we know, that we share those values, and that what we share in common, to echo the words of the MP who was murdered a few years ago, Joe Cox, we have much more in common than what divides us. And that goes quite generally, but it goes also for our thinking about moral right and wrong.
Professor Richard Norman, thank you very much for joining us.